The moment my husband realized he was about to lose everything was the same moment he finally saw me. I remember standing there, just a few feet away from him, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the open courtyard where the event was being held, the air filled with the low murmur of dozens of voices blending into one restless noise, investors, partners, employees, all gathered under a clear blue sky that felt far too calm for what was about to happen. And right in the center of it all was Daniel, my husband, the man who had always walked into every room like he owned it, now standing still, his shoulders slightly tense, his jaw tighter than I had ever seen before, holding onto a version of control that was already slipping through his fingers. And for a moment no one noticed me, which wasn't unusual, because for years I had learned how to exist quietly beside him, to smile when expected, to nod when appropriate, to let him speak first, speak louder, speak with certainty, while I stayed just a step behind, watching, listening, understanding more than anyone ever realized. And maybe that was why what happened next felt so different, because this time I wasn't just watching, I was waiting for the exact second when everything would shift, when the illusion he had built so carefully would begin to crack in front of everyone. And as I stood there, I could still hear his voice from weeks earlier echoing in my mind, calm, dismissive, almost amused, telling me I was overthinking, that my concerns about my own company were nothing more than stress, that I needed to relax, that not every problem was as serious as I made it sound. And I remember the way he didn't even look up from his phone when he said it, like my words didn't carry weight, like they didn't deserve his full attention. And I remember how quiet I became after that, how I chose not to argue, not to push, not to prove anything in that moment, because something inside me had already shifted, something small but permanent. And now here we were, weeks later, in a place filled with people who once admired him, who trusted him, who believed in the strength of his company, and I could feel it in the air, that subtle change, the tension building beneath polite conversations, the way people glanced at each other just a second too long, the way smiles didn't quite reach their eyes anymore. And Daniel, for the first time, seemed to notice it too, his gaze moving across the crowd, searching, calculating, trying to understand what was happening before anyone said it out loud. And that was when he finally looked at me, really looked at me, not as the woman standing beside him, not as the wife who shared his last name, but as someone he suddenly realized he might have misunderstood. And I didn't say anything, I didn't need to, because everything that was about to unfold had already begun. And the truth was, by the time he realized he needed my help, it was almost too late. Before everything started to fall apart that afternoon, there was a time when our life looked exactly like what people imagined success should be, clean, structured, almost effortless from the outside. And if you had asked anyone who knew us, they would have said the same thing, that Daniel Carter had built something impressive and that I was lucky to stand beside him. And maybe at some point I believed that too, because Daniel had a way of making certainty feel contagious. He spoke with confidence, moved with purpose, and people listened, always listened, whether it was in a boardroom, at a dinner table, or even during quiet conversations at home. And I learned early on how to adjust to that rhythm, how to choose my words carefully, how to wait for the right moment to speak, because in our world timing mattered almost as much as the truth itself. And still there was a part of me that existed outside of his shadow, a part that had its own goals, its own risks, its own company, that I had spent years building from nothing, late nights, early mornings, decisions that no one saw but me. And it was not as big as his, not as polished, not as visible, but it was mine, completely mine, and that mattered more than I ever said out loud. And I remember the night everything shifted. It was quiet, just the two of us in the kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound between us. And I told him that something was wrong, not dramatically, not emotionally, just facts, numbers that did not add up, a partner who suddenly delayed responses, contracts that felt unstable, small details that most people would ignore. But I could not, because I had built that company piece by piece, and I knew exactly when something felt off. And he listened, at least at first, but not the way I needed him to. His attention drifting, his expression calm in a way that felt distant, like he had already decided what this was before I finished explaining it. And then he smiled slightly, the kind of smile that was meant to reassure but instead made me feel smaller. And he said I was reading too much into it, that every business goes through phases, that stress can make problems feel bigger than they are. And I stood there, holding on to words that suddenly felt unnecessary, because the more I tried to explain, the less it seemed to matter. And what stayed with me was not just what he said, but how easily he said it, how quickly he dismissed something that had taken over my thoughts for weeks. And I nodded, because arguing would have changed nothing. And I told myself maybe he was right, maybe I was overthinking, maybe I just needed time. But deep down there was something else, something quieter and far more certain, a feeling that this was not just a small issue, that something larger was moving beneath the surface, something I could not fully see yet. And that night, while Daniel went back to his emails and calls, confident in a world that always seemed to respond to him. I stayed awake longer than I should have, staring at my laptop screen, reviewing the same documents again and again, not because I was unsure, but because I needed to be absolutely certain. And the more I looked, the clearer it became this was not just my problem. It was the beginning of something that would reach far beyond my company, far beyond what either of us expected. And the part that I could not ignore was this: by the time Daniel realized it was real, it would already be too late to stop it the way he was used to. The next few days felt different, not dramatic on the surface, nothing that anyone else would notice, but inside my world, everything had started to shift in a quiet and unsettling way. The kind of shift that does not announce itself but slowly rearranges everything you thought was stable. And I remember sitting in my office early one morning, the sunlight barely coming through the blinds, casting thin lines across my desk as I stared at the latest report. Numbers that used to make sense now forming patterns that I could not ignore anymore. Delayed payments, unusual contract clauses, small inconsistencies that, when placed side by side, told a much bigger story, and I could feel it in my chest, that steady pressure building, not panic but certainty. And I picked up my phone more than once, thinking about calling Daniel, thinking maybe I should try again, explain it differently, present it in a way he would take seriously. But every time I thought about his expression that night, the calm dismissal, the quiet confidence that I was simply overreacting, something inside me stopped, not out of pride but out of clarity, because this was no longer about convincing him. This was about understanding what was really happening before it was too late. And as I kept digging, reviewing emails, tracing communication threads, I started noticing a name that appeared more often than it should have, a partner company that both of our businesses had worked with in different capacities. Nothing unusual at first glance, but the timing did not feel right there. Responses slowing down on my side while increasing activity on his, contracts being adjusted, meetings being rescheduled, small moves that individually meant nothing, but together created a pattern that was impossible to ignore. And that was the moment something cold settled in my thoughts, because if I was right, then this was never just about my company. And I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling for a second, letting that realization sink in, because it changed everything, not just the scale of the problem but the consequences of it. And I remember whispering to myself that I needed proof, not assumptions, not instincts, something undeniable, something that could not be brushed aside with a simple smile or a casual explanation. And that meant I had to go deeper, even if it meant stepping into areas that made me uncomfortable, conversations that required careful wording, questions that could not sound like accusations. And later that afternoon, I attended a small networking event, the kind Daniel always enjoyed: open space, people moving freely, conversations overlapping, the kind of environment where information traveled quietly between handshakes and polite smiles. And I stayed close enough to observe, not to interrupt, watching how people interacted, who avoided certain topics, who changed their tone at specific names. And that was when I noticed it, a brief conversation between two executives who did not realize I was close enough to hear. Their voices low but clear enough to catch a single phrase that made everything inside me tighten. Something about restructuring agreements, something about shifting assets before the next quarter. And although they did not mention Daniel directly, I knew because the pieces were already forming in my mind, connecting faster than I could stop them. And I stood there, holding my composure, my expression calm, even as my thoughts moved rapidly beneath the surface, because if what I suspected was true, then Daniel was not just unaware. He was already part of something that was about to collapse. And the worst part was not that he did not see it coming. It was that he had already chosen not to listen when it mattered most. I did not confront him that night, even though every instinct inside me told me to, even though the pieces were aligning too clearly to ignore, because something deeper held me back, something that was not fear, but a quiet realization that once I said it out loud, there would be no going back to the version of us that existed before. And I was not sure he was ready to hear it, or worse, I was not sure he would listen even now. And so I chose silence, not the kind that comes from weakness, but the kind that comes from watching, from waiting, from understanding more than the other person realizes. And when I got home, the house felt the same as always, lights warm, everything in place, as if nothing outside those walls had shifted. And Daniel was already there, sitting at the kitchen counter with his laptop open, focused, absorbed in his work the way he always was, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, his attention locked into a world that had always responded to him exactly the way he expected. And for a moment I just stood there, watching him, noticing the details I had overlooked before, the confidence in the way he sat, the calm in his expression, the Certainty that everything was under control, and it made something tighten inside me because I knew something he did not, and that gap between us felt larger than it ever had before. And when he finally looked up, he smiled, casual, effortless, like nothing had changed, and asked how my day was, and I answered simply, keeping my voice steady, choosing each word carefully, not because I was hiding the truth, but because I was measuring whether it would matter if I said it again, and I tried. Just once more, not with urgency, not with emotion, but with clarity, explaining that the situation was not improving, that the partner I had mentioned earlier was behaving inconsistently, that there were signs of restructuring that did not align with our agreements, and he listened again, or at least it looked like he did, but I could see it in his eyes, that same quiet dismissal forming before I even finished, and he leaned back slightly, exhaling as if I was describing something routine, something predictable, and he told me that large companies adjust all the time, that negotiations shift, that I needed to trust the process, and then he added something that stayed with me longer than anything else. He said that not every situation required intervention, that sometimes stepping back was the smarter move, and I nodded slowly, not because I agreed but because I understood something important in that moment. He was not seeing what I was seeing, not because he could not, but because he believed he did not need to, and that belief was more dangerous than any external threat. And I felt the distance between us grow in a way that words could not fix, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet separation of perspective. And later that night, while he continued working, confident and focused, I moved to the living room, opening my laptop again, going back to the data, the messages, the contracts, tracing every detail with more precision than before, because now it was not just about confirming a problem, it was about understanding its full reach. And as the hours passed, one thing became clearer with every file I reviewed: this was not random, it was structured, intentional, designed to shift control without drawing immediate attention. And the realization settled heavily in my thoughts, because if I could see it this clearly, then eventually others would too, and when they did, it would not be quiet, it would not be subtle, it would happen all at once. And the only question that remained was whether Daniel would recognize it before that moment arrived, or if he would be standing right in the center of it, unprepared, while everything he believed was stable began to disappear right in front of him. The next morning, everything looked normal again. And that was what made it more unsettling than anything else, because when something is truly wrong, you expect signs, you expect noise, disruption, something visible that confirms what you are feeling. But instead, the world kept moving exactly as it always had. Emails continued to arrive, meetings stayed on schedule, and Daniel walked out the door with the same confidence he carried every single day, adjusting his jacket, checking his watch, already focused on the next conversation, the next decision, the next opportunity. And for a moment, I wondered if I was the only one who could see what was coming, if I was the only one standing at the edge of something that had not fully revealed itself yet. And I sat at the kitchen table long after he left, my coffee untouched, staring at my phone, going over everything I had found the night before, replaying conversations, connecting details, trying to see if there was something I had missed, something that would change the direction of all of this. But there was nothing. The pattern was still there, clear and consistent, and the more I thought about it, the more one question kept returning: why would a partner shift their behavior so suddenly unless they already knew something the rest of us did not? And that thought stayed with me as I opened my laptop again, pulling up new data, checking recent updates, and that was when I saw it, a notification that should have been routine, but instead made my entire body go still: a revised agreement filed quietly, timestamped late the previous night, involving the same partner company, and this time Daniel's company was directly connected to it, not just indirectly, not through general association, but through a clause that transferred certain operational controls under specific conditions. And I leaned closer to the screen, reading every line carefully, my heart beating faster, not out of panic but out of confirmation, because this was exactly what I had been trying to understand: the structure, the intention, the timing, and it was all there, hidden behind language that sounded standard but carried consequences that were anything but. And I knew instantly that Daniel had either overlooked it or trusted someone who should not have been trusted, and the weight of that realization settled heavily on me, because this was no longer a possibility, it was happening, already in motion, already beyond the point where a simple correction could fix it. And I closed my eyes for a second, taking a slow breath, because now the situation had changed completely. This was not just about protecting my company anymore, this was about something much bigger, something that was about to reach him whether he was ready or not. And I picked up my phone again, my thumb hovering over his name, thinking about calling him, telling him everything, forcing him to see what I was seeing. But then I stopped, not because I did not care, but because I remembered exactly how he had looked at me, how easily he had dismissed my concerns, And I realized that if I called him now without undeniable proof that he could not ignore, he would do the same thing again, and this time it would cost him everything. And so I lowered my phone slowly, setting it back on the table, my mind already shifting from uncertainty to strategy, because if he would not listen, then I needed to be ready for the moment when he would have no choice but to, and deep down, I knew that moment was coming much faster than he expected, because moves like this do not stay hidden for long, and when they finally surface they do not give you time to prepare, they expose everything all at once, and the only question left was whether I would step in when it happened, or let him face the consequences of not believing me. By the time I fully understood how deep it went, I also understood something else. I was already too late to stop it quietly, because whatever agreement had been put in place was no longer just a risk, it was active, moving forward without hesitation. And that meant the damage would not appear slowly, it would surface all at once, and I sat there staring at the screen, rereading the same clause over and over again, the language so carefully written that most people would have skimmed past it without a second thought. But I knew better now. I knew exactly what it meant: conditional control, temporary authority, emergency restructuring. Words that sounded harmless until you realized they were designed to take power at the exact moment a company showed weakness, and Daniel had signed into that structure without realizing what it would allow. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt something close to hesitation, not because I did not know what to do, but because I knew exactly what it would cost me to do it, because stepping in now would mean stepping into his world, his decisions, his mistakes, and exposing everything he had chosen not to see. And I closed my laptop slowly, letting that thought settle, because this was no longer about being right, it was about deciding how far I was willing to go for someone who had not been willing to listen to me. And that question stayed with me for the rest of the day, through meetings, through calls, through conversations that I barely registered because my mind was already somewhere else, mapping out possibilities, scenarios, outcomes, and every path led to the same conclusion: if I did nothing, his company would collapse under a structure he did not understand, and it would happen publicly, quickly, without warning, and if I stepped in too early, he would resist, dismiss, possibly even block the very solution that could save him, and that left only one option, one narrow moment where the truth would be undeniable, where no explanation would be needed, where he would have to listen because everything around him would be falling apart, and I did not like that option. I did not like waiting for things to break before fixing them. But this was not a situation I could control the way I wanted to. This was a situation that had already been set in motion by someone else, and I was simply deciding how to respond to it. And later that evening, when Daniel came home, everything about him still looked the same: composed, confident, unaware. He spoke about his upcoming event, a large outdoor presentation with investors and partners, something important, something that would set the tone for the next quarter. And as he talked, I felt a quiet shift inside me, because I knew exactly when it would happen now. I knew that the event he was preparing for so carefully was not going to unfold the way he expected. And I watched him for a moment longer, noticing how certain he still was, how firmly he believed in the structure he had built, and I realized that by the time he stepped onto that stage, everything would already be in place: the agreement, the trigger, the shift of control, and he would not see it until it was happening in front of everyone. And I nodded as he spoke, responding just enough to keep the conversation normal, because there was no point in saying more, not anymore. And that night, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling in the quiet dark, one thought remained steady, not emotional, not uncertain, just clear: I was not going to stop what was coming, I was going to let it happen, and then, at the exact moment it could not be ignored, I was going to decide whether to save him or not. The day of the event arrived with a kind of calm that did not feel real, the sky clear, the air warm, the kind of perfect weather people usually remembered for the wrong reasons. And as I stepped out of the car, I could already hear the low hum of voices gathering in the open courtyard: investors, executives, media, all moving in small circles of conversation, holding drinks, exchanging polite smiles, unaware that beneath the surface of this carefully planned event, something had already begun to unravel. And I stayed near the edge of the space, just far enough to observe without being noticed, my eyes moving across the crowd, taking in every detail: the stage set at the center, the large screen behind it displaying Daniel's company logo, the rows of chairs filling quickly as more people arrived, and there he was, moving confidently between groups, shaking hands, speaking with that same steady assurance that had always defined him, his voice calm, controlled, as if nothing in the world could disrupt what he had built. And for a moment, I almost questioned everything again, almost wondered if I had been wrong, if maybe this would pass without consequence. But then I saw it. Subtle at first, almost invisible, the shift in tone between conversations, the way certain people leaned closer when they spoke, The way others glanced toward the stage with something that was not anticipation, but uncertainty, and I felt it immediately, that quiet change in the atmosphere, like the air had become heavier without anyone acknowledging it out loud. And when Daniel finally stepped onto the stage, the crowd settled, the noise fading into a focused silence, all attention turning toward him as he began to speak, outlining plans, projections, growth, everything he had prepared so carefully, every word delivered with confidence, every detail presented as if the future was already secure. And I stood there watching him, knowing exactly how fragile that moment was, because beneath every number he was presenting, beneath every promise he was making, there was a structure he did not fully understand already shifting into place. And then it happened, not with a dramatic interruption, not with a loud announcement, but with something far more unsettling, a quiet movement among a group of executives near the front. A few exchanged looks, a phone passed between hands, a screen turned briefly toward someone else, and I saw the exact second it reached Daniel, not through words, but through the change in his expression, so slight that most people would have missed it. But I knew him well enough to recognize it immediately, the hesitation, the smallest pause between sentences, the flicker of confusion before he regained control of his voice, and he continued speaking, trying to move forward, trying to maintain the flow, but it was already happening, the information spreading through the crowd faster than he could contain it, quiet whispers replacing the earlier confidence, heads turning, attention shifting away from the presentation and toward each other, and Daniel felt it. I could see it in the way his posture changed, the way his eyes searched the audience, trying to understand what had just shifted, and for the first time, he did not look certain, he looked unprepared, standing in front of a crowd that was no longer fully listening. And I remained where I was, still silent, watching as the moment I had been waiting for unfolded exactly as I knew it would. Because this was the point where everything became undeniable, where no explanation could hide it, no confidence could override it, and as the tension built, as the silence between his words grew longer, as the crowd began to realize something was wrong, Daniel finally looked out into the audience again, and this time, his eyes found me, not by chance but with intention, and in that moment I knew. He understood, not everything yet, but enough to realize that I had seen this coming long before he did. And that realization was only the beginning of what was about to happen next. For a few seconds everything seemed to exist in a strange balance, like the entire event was holding its breath, waiting for something to break, and Daniel stood there on the stage, still trying to continue, still holding on to control with every word he spoke, but it was already slipping. I could see it in the way his voice slowed just slightly, in the way his eyes kept shifting toward the front row where a group of executives were now openly checking their phones, whispering to each other, without even trying to hide it anymore, and the large screen behind him, which had been displaying his projections, suddenly flickered for a moment, not a full interruption, just enough to draw attention, just enough to make people look twice, and that was when the silence changed. It was no longer focused, it was uncertain, uneasy, like the crowd was beginning to understand that something was wrong but had not yet fully grasped what it was, and Daniel paused mid-sentence just for a second, but that second was enough for the room to feel it, enough for the control he had been maintaining to crack, and I felt my heartbeat steady instead of racing, because this was the moment I had been preparing for, the exact point where everything became visible, undeniable, and I took a step forward, then another, moving through the crowd as people shifted slightly to make space, their attention no longer fixed entirely on the stage, some of them noticing me, others too focused on the growing tension to care, and with each step my thoughts became clearer, not emotional, not rushed, just precise, because I knew exactly what needed to be done. And when I reached the front, Daniel saw me again, this time not with confusion, but with something else, something closer to realization, and he stopped speaking completely, not because he chose to, but because he did not know what to say next, and that silence spread across the entire space, a quiet that felt heavier than any noise, and I stepped up beside the stage, not rushing, not drawing attention with urgency, just moving with intention, and when I spoke, my voice was calm, steady, carrying just enough to be heard without forcing it, and I did not start with explanations or accusations. I started with facts, clear, structured, undeniable, referencing the agreement, the clause, the conditions that had already been triggered, the transfer of operational control that had begun without public acknowledgement, and as I spoke, I could feel the shift happen again, this time stronger, the crowd leaning in, the whispers stopping, attention returning not out of expectation, but out of necessity, because now they were hearing something they could not ignore, something that explained the tension they had already felt, And I saw the recognition in their expressions, the realization spreading across faces one by one, and Daniel stood there beside me, completely still, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something more real, because he was hearing it too, not as a theory, not as a possibility, but as the truth laid out in front of everyone. And I continued, not to expose him, but to complete the picture, explaining not just what had happened but how it could be contained, how the structure could be reversed before full control was lost, outlining the steps with the same precision I had used to understand it in the first place. And for the first time since the event began, the energy in the space shifted again, not toward panic but toward focus, because now there was direction. And when I finally stopped speaking, the silence that followed was different, no longer uncertain but heavy with understanding. And Daniel looked at me, really looked at me, not as someone he had dismissed, not as someone standing beside him out of obligation, but as the only person in that moment who had fully understood what was happening before anyone else, and the only person who had just given him a way out. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the entire space needed time to process what had just happened, the shift so sudden yet so precise that it left no room for denial, and I could feel the weight of every gaze, not just on Daniel anymore, but on me, the quiet observer who had stepped forward at the exact moment everything began to fall apart. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the energy began to change, not chaotic, not panicked, but controlled, conversations restarting in lower tones, people turning toward each other with a different kind of focus, not speculation but strategy, because now they understood the situation, and more importantly, they understood there was still a way to manage it. And Daniel remained beside me, silent, his earlier composure replaced by something far more honest, his posture no longer projecting certainty but absorbing reality. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was different, steadier in a quieter way, not trying to dominate the moment but to regain balance within it, acknowledging the situation without fully explaining it, because he did not need to, not anymore, the truth had already been laid out. And as the event slowly resumed with a different tone, I stepped back, not out of hesitation, but because my part in that moment was complete, and I could feel it clearly, that shift not just in the room, but between us, something unspoken yet undeniable. And later, when the crowd began to thin and the conversations moved into smaller groups, Daniel found me again, away from the center, away from the attention, and for a few seconds, he did not say anything, just stood there, looking at me in a way he never had before, not with certainty, not with quiet dismissal, but with recognition. And when he finally spoke, it was simple, no long explanation, no attempt to justify what had happened, just an acknowledgement that carried more weight than anything else he could have said. And I listened without interrupting, not because I needed to hear an apology, but because I understood what that moment meant. It was not about words, it was about realization, about seeing clearly what had been overlooked. And I nodded, not as a sign of agreement, but as acceptance of what had changed, because the truth was, I had not stepped in to prove him wrong. I had stepped in because I knew what would happen if I did not. And as we stood there in the quiet space left behind after the crowd had moved on, I realized something that had been building throughout everything that had happened. Value does not come from being believed in the moment. It comes from being prepared when it matters. And for the first time, Daniel saw that, not as an idea but as something real, something he had experienced in front of everyone. And I did not need to say anything more, because the shift had already taken place, not just in his company, not just in the situation we had just faced, but in the way he saw me, and the way I saw myself. And as we walked away from the event, side by side but different than before, there was a quiet understanding between us, not perfect, not complete, but real. And sometimes